Hello everyone and welcome to the Constructive Criticism Network. This network is here to help you improve at Magic the Gathering at every level. From Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic, we've got you covered. If you want to hear the entire network, head on over to our sponsor at pureMTGO.com, where you can hear each and every show, each and every week, and check out their sponsor, MTGO Traders, and tell them that the CCMTG Network sent you. Now sit back, enjoy the show. From YouTube, podcasts, and more, here's this week's episode from ConstructiveCriticism.com.
How's it going, everybody? It is 6 o'clock on Thursday night, October 29th, 2020, and that means it's time for this, the 92nd trip down the Homeward Path. My name is Adam, and I've got a few questions for you. First of all, are you a fan of Magic the Gathering? I mean, I really hope so, if you're listening to this show, a Magic the Gathering podcast. But is there something in your life that takes precedence over your Magic hobby? You know, other things are more important. You put Magic to the wayside, it's an escape, it's something you like to do. But whether it's your job, your partner, your children, any and all of the above, Magic is not priority one, but that's okay. Are you still trying to improve at Magic, despite all of these struggles, despite the fact that it puts you at a market disadvantage? Well, if that sounds like you, I hope you've got a bunch of creatures or a bunch of mana laying around, because we're about to have us a convocation. We're going to look at the 3 B's of magical improvement, budgeting, brewing, and breaking bad habits, after a word from our sponsor, or about our sponsor. We are brought to you by PureMTGO.com. PureMTGO is one of the largest depositories of Magic content on the web. There's something for literally everyone there. You want Commander content, they got it. You want Pauper content, they got it. You want limited content, they got it. You want general malaise about the state of the game, they've got it. And speaking of having something for everybody at the competitive level, don't forget our parent network at ConstructiveCriticism.com. Our stuff may appear on PureMTGO, but we do our own thing too. Whether it's the regular 60-card formats with Mason and Alley over on Constructive Criticism, and Pioneer specific on MTG Trailblazers, or Pauper specific with Common Knowledge. Whatever the case may be, Constructive Criticism's got you covered, as the intro stated, from Pauper Leagues to Top 1000 Mythic. And I'm decidedly somewhere in between those. And then last but not least, if you like what I'm doing enough to help me keep doing it, head over to patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. This show is always going to be free, and every major piece of content that I put out is always going to be free. But if you like what you're hearing enough to keep doing it and have a say in what it is that I'm talking about, Patreon's the easiest way to get bumped to the front of the line, as it were. And speaking of words that start with the letter B, I can do better on segues, but we're going to dive into Budget Spotlight. First one I want to talk about is one that maybe doesn't get the credit it deserves, because I can't think of a deck that plays this card. It may have seen play when it was in Standard initially, way back in RTR. But I genuinely cannot think of a deck that plays this card. And this card is Dryad Militant. Dryad Militant is either a white or green mana, buys you a 2/1 creature. Said 2/1 creature is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's a 1-drop. I mean, it's definitely a 1-drop. But it's a disruptive 1-drop. It's a surprisingly disruptive 1-drop, because it also says, if an instant or sorcery would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. That's pretty big game. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. This is a pretty big game. It applies pressure as a 1-drop, 2-power creature. It's a 2/1. It doesn't apply a ton of pressure, but I mean, Savannah Lions has been a respectable Magic card since Alpha. It randomly hoses decks built to generate value out of the graveyard, i.e. Phoenix decks, the Delve shells, the decks, like it's randomly like reasonable against Death Shadow. Because unless they kill it, like their Thought Seizes get exiled, their the instants and sorceries they mill off Thought Scour get exiled, the Thought Scour itself gets exiled. They don't have things to delve away to put a giant Gurmag Angler or Tassiger onto the battlefield. If they're playing green, it also weakens Become Immense. You know, it's a body on the table that applies pressure, while at the same time potentially slowing your opponent's ability to generate tempo. And having that packaged together in one body is really nice. It's also, thanks to its hybrid cost, you are not locked into one specific color or even combination. It's just a thoroughly reasonable Magic card. Next up, at Rare, we have Dromoka's Command. Now, before I dive in, I always do this. I forget to name the price on the first card. Dryad Militant is every bit 25 cents. It is a quarter, so your opportunity cost, the cards you miss out on by getting a place at a Dryad Militant, is a whole $1. I think we'll manage. I think we'll figure it out. But next up on the list is Dromoka's Command at $2.50. Dromoka's Command is white and a green instant. Choose 2 modes. As nearly anything that has the word command as an instant is. Choose 2 modes. Target player sacrifices an enchantment. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. And prevent all damage from target spell. I think it's that targets you or a creature you control, if I'm not terribly mistaken. That's the mode I almost never use, so I just forget exactly how it's worded. It's largely just used to counter burn spells that are pointed at my face. So I tend to forget things. But the layer of protection against burn spells is nice, rather than just trying to aggressively use life gain and getting blown out by Skullcrack. Of course, depending on your format, you may get blown out by Bone Crusher Giant or Flaring Pain or whatever, but it is what it is. The +1/+1 counter plus fight is probably your most common mode, and it is one of the easiest ways to dominate your creature mirrors, because you make your creature bigger and then kill theirs. You get to do both things you wanted to do at once. That seems thoroughly reasonable. And it serves as enchantment removal with upside, since it can randomly just snipe down a god. That's right, it doesn't say destroy target enchantment. It says target player sacrifices an enchantment. And all those pesky gods from original Theros and Theros Beyond Death happen to be enchantment creatures. So, do with that information what you will. But the fact that it makes them sacrifice an enchantment, it's naturalized, it's demystified with potential upside, because you can randomly snipe an indestructible one or a hexproof one if the opportunity presents itself. Moving on to our mythic, we have Voice of Resurgence. And I've waited a long time to be able to put Voice of Resurgence on here. Voice of Resurgence is one of my favorite cards in Magic. I know I don't seem like a Voice of Resurgence guy. I don't seem like a guy who really likes 2-drop creatures that are value-oriented and punish the opponent for playing spells in my turn, but good cards are good, and they don't care what you normally like. Voice of Resurgence is $4 a copy. Basically every edition, too, for what it's worth. And Voice of Resurgence is a white and a green for a 2/2. And when it dies, or an opponent casts a spell during your turn, create a 0/0 it may be an XX elemental. I can't remember the exact thing, or maybe it's a star, whatever the case may be. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control. So, at minimum, this is a 2-for-1 at 2 mana, right? It's a great 2-drop to curve into, as it usually replaces itself at worst with upside against opponents who do not take text into account when they're deciding when and how to remove something. For example, if you choose to play something that exiles instead of just something that kills it, I obviously don't get the token, but if you play that thing on my turn, I still do. So on and so forth. If you magma spray it, it gets exiled, so I don't get 2 tokens. But it's particularly embarrassing if your opponent, you slam that thing down and they go in-step Fatal Push. Or in-step Shock or Shock or Wild Slash. That's real embarrassing for the opponent in that situation. I'm like, thank you, I will take 4 power worth of creatures. I will very much be happy to do that. It is valuable. Hang on. Gotta get a little light here. It's getting hard to see. But it is valuable for any creature-centric deck in its colors, as it doesn't have to go wide to generate value. I.e., as long as you're getting triggers, you're going to get plenty wide enough. And even if you don't, it's still chipping in for damage as long as you're playing additional creatures. Whether it's hit off a collected company or just turn 1, 1-drop creature, turn 2, Voice of Resurgence, turn 3, 3-drop creature, it's still reasonable. And last but not least, our Commander Spotlight for Budget Spotlight this week is Glare of Subdual. Glare of Subdual is a 50-cent card. It is an enchantment, 2 a green and a white. And it says, tap an untapped creature you control, tap target artifact or creature an opponent controls. And obviously it was the centerpiece of one of the most iconic standard decks of its time in Ghazi Glare. But as far as why it's useful in Commander, it can tap down problematic creatures, whether a commander with, trying to be Voltron, a particularly pesky blocker. The ability to end of turn tap down your blockers can just create a lethal attack. Because I can tap my whole team, even if I just made it on your turn. Tap my whole team, tap your whole team, untap, kill you. Tapping down mana rocks, stacks pieces, and even group hug pieces is rare disruption for green and white. I.e. cards like Winter Orb or Howling Mine that only are negative if they are untapped. I can tap the Winter Orb. Or I can tap the oh no. Anyway, I can tap the Winter Orb, tap the Howling Mine, so draw my card from Howling Mine and then tap the Howling Mine so that nobody else gets to take advantage for a little while. Whatever the case may be, it's useful. It also randomly will tap down artifact lands. Tapping down a Soul Ring or tapping down a Mana Vault is hilarious. Tapping down a Mana Crypt is hilarious. It's just good fun, right? Good, clean living. It's a way to help equalize the table. And then last but not least, the funniest synergy that I've discovered with it is in conjunction with specifically my wife's Selesnya commander in Miri Weatherlight Duelist. Because while Miri's attacking, your opponent's only allowed to block with one creature. Not one creature per attacker, mind you. Just one creature. Well, the downside being, if you're swinging out at somebody, you're putting yourself in danger of an alpha strike back, right? Well, Glare of Subdual gives Miri a way to trigger the other half of its ability without having to expose Miri to the rigors of combat. The other half of Miri's ability is as long as she is tapped, each opponent can only attack you with one creature. So, decks that are going just as wide as you are, you can tap Miri down, tap the biggest creature down, and then you set up the potential to in-step, tap down blockers from everybody, untap, play Coat of Arms, and kill everybody. So it's really, really cool. So, that wraps up Budget Spotlight, and now we move into our brew of the week, which is green-white counters. So the neat thing about green-white counters is the core engine is actually fairly compact. It's really nice. Hardened Scales and Conclave Mentor are your enablers, and then your payoffs are largely customizable. For those of you who don't know what those are, Hardened Scales is a 1-mana enchantment that says if a +1/+1 counter would be placed on a creature you control, that many counters +1 are placed on it instead. And it sounds innocuous enough. It's not as busted in half as something like a Doubling Season at similarly low mana costs would be. But the fact that it's a 1-drop that then turns around and starts to enable you is what makes it, is the key. It's the linchpin. Because frequently what will happen is you will just kind of curve out big dumb creatures. And the payoffs themselves for having access to an additional +1/+1 counter are largely customizable, and that's what makes the deck so interesting. Is because there's a lot of different ways to build it. You have Conclave Mentor, Hardened Scales, and a whole bunch of things that put counters on creatures that exist in Pioneer. Whether it's the classic version with cards like Pelt Collector, Experiment 1, Nissa Voice of Zendikar, Rishkar Pima Renegade, Basri Solidarity. Whether you want to go the artifact synergy route with the X spells like Chamber Sentry, Stone Coil Serpent, Hangerback Walker that will enter with an additional counter for each one of those enablers you have. Or if you want to go with the sort of Hydra tribal aspect that gives you the ability to go tall, like you can play some big dumb creatures, and then if they blow everything up, you recover. Cards like Hooded Hydra, if they die, you get a token for each power that Hydra had, and then you can turn around and put more counters on them. So, and then last but not least, you have the Hate Bear package, which allows the combination of disruptive creatures. Cards like Droneth Magistrate, Hushbringer, what have you. Droneth Magistrate, Hushbringer, with cards like Basri Solidarity, with cards like Nissa Voice of Zendikar, that will then enable you to make your disruptive creatures very, very large. So your opponent will be stymied as far as their development goes, but you'll be able to create that kind of time-honored traditional package of disruption plus clock to kill them before they can break the little soft lock you've got set up. Now, as far as utility spells go, Dromoka's Command is a house in this deck. Dromoka's Command is really good in this deck. +1/+1 counter and fight. +1/+1 counter and make you sacrifice an enchantment. +1/+1 counter and prevent that burn spell. Like, all three of those combinations are thoroughly acceptable when you've got an enabler or two on the board. Depending on your configuration, whether or not you're playing a bunch of planeswalkers and other spells, collected company is also valuable. Or if you're playing like the X spell artifact one, obviously collected company is not quite so enticing. Unless you're playing Metallic Mimic, and then things go completely off the wall. Metallic Mimic, if it names Construct, and you flip Hangerback Walker and Chamber Sentry, you will get a 1/1 Chamber Sentry, and you'll get a +1/+1 counter on Chamber Sentry and Hangerback Walker, and then all your enablers will kick in and put extra counters on them. Fall free. So, whatever the build you want to go with, it's pretty sweet. And then as far as sideboard packages go, it's got a little bit more to offer than you would think. Even if you don't want to play the Hate Bear package in the main deck, it's definitely something you can access in the board, especially if you're in for cards like Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, Basri Solidarity, Basri Cat. And then you can sideboard into Droneth Magistrate, Containment Priest, and then you get to, like, turn 1 Hardened Scales, turn 2 Droneth Magistrate against the turn 2, what is the card? I'm drawing a blank here. I guess Containment Priest would be a really good one against the Oops All Spells deck, right? Turn 2 Containment Priest, turn 3 Rishkar Pima Renegade, put 2 counters on both. Let's start beating you down. You got 3 turns to break it. Let's go. And in particular, something like Dryad Militant is also reasonable after sideboard in this deck, because not only is it a reasonably sized 1-mana creature, it's gonna get bigger. It's like that scene from Avengers Endgame with the Hulk. You play your 1-drop creature and they look all sad and mopey, and you're like, it'll grow. So, green-white counters, as opposed to the more popular green-black counters in Pioneer. Green-black Scales was the order of the day for a very long time. I would argue the green-white Scales deck actually has a better look against the field, because while you miss out on cards like Thoughtseize and Duress, trading Conclave Mentor for Winding Constrictor is largely semantics in Pioneer, and you get to pick up a whole bunch of other stuff. Like really powerful, back-breaking sideboard cards. Even if you just want to go classic and board into stuff like Rest in Peace. It's totally reasonable. And that brings us to our main topic this week. In case you haven't already guessed, it is Selesnya week here on Homeward Path. And we started this guild cycle series, or this color combination series 2 weeks ago with Rakdos. We moved the next step around the color wheel and paired the red from Rakdos with the green from Gruul. Well, this week we're moving the next step around the color wheel, and the green from Gruul becomes paired with the white to make Selesnya. So what is the Selesnya Conclave? Well, first of all, it was officially introduced by name in Ravnica City of Guilds in October 2005. I've been playing Magic for roughly a year, and I hated it. Not because it was too good, not because I thought it was great, not because I thought it was broken. I just didn't like tokens decks. And by and large, that's what the original Selesnya deck was. They were depicted as embodiments of unity, harmony, cooperation, and strength, with a hive mind and clear roles for every member. The best shorthand way to describe the way the Selesnya Conclave, the guild, is depicted in the lore in Ravnica. Think the Borg from Star Trek, but less malicious. I'm not going to say not malicious, but less malicious. They're malicious in a different way. Because, I mean, it's guilds. Everybody's, instead of forcefully assimilating you, they're just convincing you to join. And then, yeah, whatever. It's also notably the home guild of one of the main characters in the Ravnica story, the original Ravnica story. This character appears in the first and last book of the trilogy. And that is Fawn Zunic, who, I'm not going to give any spoilers away. If you haven't read the book, you need to go do it. You can probably find it online somewhere, find it in an old bookstore somewhere. I hope you can, because it's good. It was back when Magic Story was consistently good, basically all the time. But moving on, what are the strengths of green and white together? You know, you think green decks, you think big dumb creatures for not a lot of mana. You think white decks, you think lots of small creatures or really good, like, walls of text big creatures. Well, you get a little bit of both of them. Selesnya as a guild, or green-white as a color pair identity, is about threats. You very, very, very seldom get a reactive Selesnya deck. It just doesn't happen. You might, you have your number one strength as a green-white mage is putting creatures onto the battlefield, because you get some of the best ones. Or you get the ability to put a whole heck of a lot of them. Whatever the case may be, you can put lots of power and toughness on the table. When we want to talk about strength of a guild, that's a real big strength. The next step after you put creatures on the battlefield, you want to make them better. You also are good at removing non-creature, non-land permanents. Yes, I know there's a little bit of land destruction in green, but not here. You know, you go way, way back, you have mass land destruction in white, so if you want to go down the road of a Selesnya land destruction deck, you definitely can. But the removal that you've got the best access to is the ability to, unique ability to remove non-creature, non-land permanents, because green is good at that. And green is good at removing non-creature permanents. White is decent at removing lots of different permanent types on the same cards. Also notable for green-white, enchantments. There's a lot of enchantments in green and white. Whether it's auras, global enchantments, enchantments matter cards. You have self-preservation effects in green-white, cards like Heroic Intervention, protection effects, my creatures or my stuff gets hexproof effects, instant speed pump effects to survive attempts to remove, whatever the case may be. And then you are really good at dominating the battlefield if left unchecked. Weaknesses, your removal is typically inefficient, narrow, or both. Which is to say, your removal is rarely in your green-white decks do you have unconditional, cheap removal. Cards like Ram Through and Primal Might can be cheap, but you've got to have a creature. Cards like Conclave Tribunal, cards like Oblivion Ring, cards like Bramble Crush can be versatile, but they cost a lot of mana. And then your cards that are really, really efficient and good at what they do tend to play very narrow roles. Cards like Veil of Summer, cards like Angel's Grace. Like, the more specialized it is in green and white, the better it becomes. The better job it does pulling its weight. It's also difficult to win in a green-white deck without attacking. I'm not saying you can't. You definitely can. There are I win the game cards out there. You can certainly build a reactive Selesnya deck that eventually snowballs an advantage somehow that kills your opponent. And then you overall have a softness to removal from the other side of the table. Because as a guild, as a color pair that is dominated by its making creatures relevant, you're going to struggle if you don't have creatures. It's just kind of how this works. You are very board dominant, board dependent, and that is definitely something to consider. As far as mechanical identities of Selesnya, the printed mechanics, we've only gotten 2 that were officially attributed to Selesnya. The original Convoke mechanic, which is your creatures can help pay this card's mana cost. Each creature you tap while casting reduces the cost by 1 of that creature's color or 1 generic mana. Convoke was their mechanic in Ravnica City of Guilds, and it was their mechanic in Guilds of Ravnica just last year. So, I guess it was just, not last year, but 2018. Fall 2018. Convoke was brought back for Guilds of Ravnica, rather than try to design a whole new mechanic. The other mechanic in Return to Ravnica was Populate, which is choose a token you control, create a copy of it. Other themes that are prevalent throughout Green and White put together are the use of tokens, creating tokens, and using them for abilities. Abilities that allow you to tap an untapped creature you control. Those work really well with tokens. Abilities that only proc, that only trigger when you have 4 or more creatures on the battlefield. That's particularly easy to achieve when you make tokens. So, one of the kind of the defining hallmarks of the Selesnya Guild is the creation and usage of tokens. Next up, anthems. We're making lots of creatures. Let's make all of them bigger. Just all of them. All my creatures are big. We go wide and then we go tall. So everybody gets to beat them up. Whether it's the actual 3-mana anthems or tribal synergies that come with lords, whatever the case may be. Just make a bunch of tokens, make them bigger is a kind of a linchpin hallmark strategy for Green White. You have Enchantress themes. Whenever you play an enchantment spell or whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, do this thing. There's a heavy concentration of those cards in Green and White. Heavy concentration. And then last but not least, specifically, Auras Matter themes are pretty unique to Green and White put together. Yeah, I know you've got them other places. But between cards like Karametra's Blessing, creatures like Aura Gnarlid, Core Spirit Dancer, cards like Daybreak Coronet that you can only attach to a creature that's already wearing an aura. There's a decent collection of protection and hexproof creatures in Green and White, so you get lots of bodies that are reliable to put auras on. Auras decks are a staple. And that brings me to typical deck archetypes you see for Green and White. And after everything we've said, the first archetype that you typically see associated with Green White is the least thought about, like the least forefront in your mind. And that's just playing a bunch of good Magic cards. In the earliest days of Magic, one of the biggest mid-range decks was Urnam-Geddon, where you combine the best efficient creature with a mass land destruction spell, so that you could kill all their lands, play this big dumb creature, kill all their lands, and then beat them to death because they couldn't cast anything as big as your Urnam-Geddon. And then if they did play something, you had Swords to Plowshares to exile. the next kind of iteration, my first iteration of green-white good stuff was Ghazi Glare, which, while it technically had a token sub-theme with cards like Vidugazi the City Tree and Glare of Subdual, it was not designed around those cards. It was a green-white mid-range deck that incorporated those cards. Its main deck was chock full of stuff like Watchwolf, a 2-mana 3/3, Loxodon Hierarch, a 4-mana 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. Yosei the Morningstar, a 6-drop 5/5 flying. When it dies, tap down 5 of their permanents and they don't untap next turn. Arashi the Sky Asunder to snipe a bunch of flyers at once. Or just be a big reach body, but frequently it was just used to kill a big flying thing. You could channel it from your hand and it would just blow up a flyer. And then even more recently, the green-white tokens deck from Battle for Zendikar era. That deck was just a collection of the best cards in Magic, or the best cards in Standard. Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. Good green and white creatures. Dramoka's Command, some removal. Collected Company. Like, you had access to everything you needed. So one of the easiest places to start when you want to look at something to do, particularly in a standard format, like the one we're in right now, which is largely kind of wide open, is just look at, if you want to look at green and white and just play the best cards, it's not going to be horrible. You can do a lot worse than like the mono green food deck splashing Baneslayer Angel at the top of the curve and some removal. Maybe Droneth Magistrate to keep those Croxa players honest. Maybe go ahead and mainboard your Hushbringers and then you shut down a lot of the enter the battlefield stuff for the Rogues deck. Like, there's some stuff there. There's things we can do. Next up is the tribal decks. Decks like Slivers and Pauper. Humans, originally in Modern, was green-white. Began its life as green-white hate bears, and then started to just graduate. It was the light bulb went off that you could play a bunch of humans in your green-white hate bears deck because a lot of them were humans, and then you would win the game that way because they couldn't do anything about it. You just curve Champion of the Parish into Thalia's Lieutenant, and then just plop a Leonin Arbiter on the battlefield, and then plop a Thalia Guardian of Thraben onto the battlefield, and turns out they couldn't do much about that. Because while you're taking advantage of your tribal synergies, you're also disrupting them to death. And then kind of the most prevalent recent day tribe for green-white has been cats, which Sarah loves so dearly. That's our Selesnya commander, is Miri Weatherlight Duelist Cat Tribal. She loves it. It's her baby. I just maintain it for her. Next up are the Enchantress decks. Decks that care about playing lots of enchantments. Not to be confused with decks that care about playing lots of auras. I'm talking about decks that want to play stuff like Yavimaya and Mesa Enchantress, Argothian Enchantress, Enchantress's Presence. These things that say whenever you cast an enchantment spell or whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So it allows you to play these things that affect the table and then continue to reload for them. Like, Solitary Confinement feels unfair in an Enchantress deck. It's, you have Shroud, creatures can't attack you. At the beginning of your upkeep, discard a card. Skip your draw phase, beginning of your upkeep, discard a card. You have Shroud, creatures can't attack you. So we'll just play another enchantment and keep drawing cards. And then eventually you close the game out by playing Replenish, and you buy all your enchantments out of the graveyard. And then one of them is Opalescence, which turns all of them into creatures, and you kill your opponent. You also have, along that same line, you have your Boggles/Auras decks that are very sort of synergy-driven. You play a lot of hexproof creatures, strap them up with auras, and make them into these super, mega, ultra big, dumb creatures. And then your opponent dies. Or they have the Edict, and you shuffle up and go to game 2. Or you just don't draw enough lands, and you shuffle up and go to game 2. You've got your synergy linear aggro decks like the Hardened Scale Shell we were talking about before, or currently in standard decks like Green-White Adventure, wherein there is a central mechanic that you are trying to exploit, and your deck is somewhat at least warped around it to take advantage. It's not always the case. There's honestly, like, linear green-white decks are kind of rare. But they're pretty sweet when they pop up. I do enjoy them. You've got Disruptive Aggro, one of the most legendary of which is Maverick in Legacy. But even taking that approach to Modern Pioneer with, a deck that's just a fat stack of disruptive dumb creatures. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. In Pioneer, Thalia, Heretic Cathar, Droneth Magistrate, Takali Honor Guard, Hushbringer, excuse me, Spirit of the Labyrinth, Grand Abolisher. These cards that just make your opponent play, draw one card, play cards on my turn Magic. They make them play the fairest form of Magic, while beating them to death with a bunch of mopey creatures. And then last but not least, you have sort of the combo aggro decks, which are, by and large, just kind of piles of cards that happen to work well together. The most recent example I can give regarding Pioneer would be the Heliod Ballista combo. But even like in Modern, you've got the Devoted Druid, Vizier of Remedies interaction that just happens to slide into your stupid Collected Company deck. So, whatever the case may be, there is something with your name on it in green-white, and that's really all there is to it. Green-white is better than it gets credit for. I never give it enough credit. Because, if I'm being candid, if I'm being as honest as I possibly can be about it, I never go out of my way to build a green-white deck. I actually frequently try to avoid it. Because I don't keep a lot of good green-white cards. I don't keep a lot of the cards that are typically good in green-white decks, because they're either really expensive or they're really niche. And those are not the kind of cards I keep a hold of unless I feel like it's going to give me a marked, noticeable advantage when I play. So, it's just not the kind of cards I collect. But it was interesting to get to do a little bit of a dive on it and kind of make the case for green-white and get us ready. But anyway, that's all I've got for this week, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, puremtgo.com. Remember to, if you like this content and others like it, go to constructivecriticism.com. If you like what I'm doing enough to help me keep doing it, go to patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. And last but not least, I am not doing dad jokes this week because we are on the verge of the general election. It's almost election day. So I am going to use this opportunity to remind everybody, if you haven't already, whether it's been absentee or going early in person, go vote. Because the only way that the only way to be absolutely certain that whoever wins these things deserve to do so is if everybody goes out and votes. Outcome be what it is. There were, I think, 90 or 9 million Americans that didn't vote in the last election. Even split down the middle, that's just a ton of people. That's a ton of people. And if it's not split down the middle either way, it could have tipped the scales of the election. So for all of those of you out there who say, my vote doesn't matter, my vote isn't important because of where I live, my voice isn't going to be heard, I understand you. I have been one of you. But the fact of the matter is, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy because it's not just about one of you. If every single person who said, my vote doesn't matter, got out and voted, suddenly that voice matters a whole lot more. So please, if you haven't already done so, make a plan to do so on Tuesday. If you got to take off work, make sure you're masked up, carry sanitizer in with you, take every precaution you need to. If you got to carry a 3-foot yardstick, stretch your arm out and slap people that get too close. Do what you got to do. But get up there, make sure your voice is heard. Please. And I will catch you next week, one way or the other. Next week, we're going to be talking about Azorius. It's going to be decidedly less fun because the Azorius are, as we all know, the fun police. So, everyone, go vote, be safe, and I'll be back next week here on the Homeward Path. Take care.